It's Just Business with Steve Thomas and your host, Chris Larry.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's Just Business on the Hogside Network, the show where we look at the dollars and cents of the sports media business empire. Steve, how you doing today?
It's good. It's my favorite part of every other Saturday at 7 in the morning.
Yeah. What do you do at 7 a.m. on the off weeks?
Well, I mean, we record the Hogsty at 9 o'clock my time, so I'm generally up anyway. But mainly it's 7 o'clock on off weeks. It's me sitting dreaming and thinking about doing It's Just Business on the following week. That's what I'm really doing.
Right. We're in deep prep in our off week.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I'm prepping for the next week. We actually do prep for this show. I mean, don't get me wrong. Even though it may sound like we don't. Chris and I are both good talkers, so we can BS our way through a lot of things. How's New York?
It's fine, normal. Getting hot, so summer's definitely officially here. But other than
Now,
that,
what's hot by your standards?
Oh, wait,
I live in South Texas.
Right, but we've gotten above 90s a couple times, so that's
really?
pretty hot. Yeah.
Not the humidity I have, though, so we still got you beat on that, I think.
Probably, yeah. And everyone welcomes it. No one's complaining yet. We don't start complaining until July.
Oh, I think New Yorkers complain about absolutely everything.
Well, yes, I guess that is part of our identity.
Of course, truthfully, Texans do too, and what it really is human beings love to complain.
Yeah, right. There's a universal truth in there, Steve. Somewhere.
I know. It's like, I'm disagreeing with my statement as I'm saying it. Texas people complain about all kinds of things.
It turns out people complain. Well, speaking of complaining, we'll start off with our local Washington, D.C. sports franchise that plays in the National Football League, because that's something that people like to complain about often and vocally, and not necessarily without good reason. But lots of news on where the heck this team will play and how many people they will play in front of that's come over the last few weeks. Lots of stuff that goes into this, but right now it appears like none of the local municipalities that basically are the geographies of the fan base really want the stadium or are being that aggressive in telling the team that they want the stadium. So, and I think probably to drive interest with these, various decision makers, the team has released more and more details about what they think the stadium will be, what it'll look like, and what it'll do. So we have just gotten a plethora of stadium-related news over the last few weeks.
Well, I mean, I could flash a picture out of the Victoria's Secret catalog and tell everybody that's my next girlfriend too, and that doesn't make it any more true. Yeah, so the team did issue a bunch of conceptual drawings about it, and the drawings look fantastic and all of that. And yes, so the state of Virginia and the state of Maryland, neither one of them look all that interesting. Just remember this, though. If you're a fan of this team, I mean, I'm not, but if you are, just go back to the early 90s and think about all the trouble that Jack Kent Cooke had in getting a stadium built for a team that was coming off a Super Bowl, that was the most popular team in the league in terms of ticket sales and all of that. It took him years to find the Landover site, and there were many, many missteps along the way. There was a site, I think it was near the bridge across the Acosta River there off the Beltway, I think. And I mean, there were others. So it's not, you can't just snap your fingers, like you're going to open, a dry cleaner. This is a major project. But that having been said, what's happened recently, I think since our last show, is the state of Virginia's support for giving Dan Snyder money has cratered in the Virginia legislature. There was a guy named Senator Chap Peterson who seems to be influential. I don't know anything about Virginia politics other than I know Glenn Youngkin exists. That's about it. But he publicly withdrew his support from the team, and a couple others did too. And so it didn't come up for a vote at all. And as we've talked about before, they reduced their commitment their proposed commitment from $1 billion to $350 million. So yeah, that puts Danny Boy in a little bit of a box. But honestly, I mean, at $350 million, he's gonna, even if that passed, he'd have to come up with another $1 billion in financing, which is a major deal. And I mean, in Maryland, I mean, they publicly said they're not going to let the team or Dan own the land. And they haven't really offered any money to him anyway of any kind of note. And the DC is a hopeless cause. So I mean, all hope is not lost, but I think it's certainly a big problem. Thoughts?
Yeah, what you just seen is he's getting very bad offers on all fronts. Obviously, DC is its own mishigash with, all kinds of different sort of local control issues and what has to happen. So that's got its own complexities, which are fairly evergreen beyond Snyder. But if you look at the other two suitors, Maryland is basically offering, this gets I don't know, misquoted is the right word, but I think people get a little bit confused because they see, oh, there's a $400 million offer, from Maryland. And even Maryland tries to talk that up, right? Governor Hogan and others have, especially as Virginia started to falter here, they said, oh, well, we've got this offer on the table. But let's be clear, the offer is $400 million in infrastructure that they would do in the area that, quite frankly, they're going to do regardless. So it's like, well, if you'd like to put the stadium back in the land oversight, we've got a bunch of public development. We can play nice together and see how those things, kind of support each other. But Maryland's doing that regardless. They're not doing it because of Snyder. And it's like, well, here's something you can piggyback on, Dan. That's really what's happening here. So, this idea that that's a $400 million offer for the stadium is a misnomer, no matter how much Maryland wants to kind of spin it. So you really are talking, and yeah, I mean, the fact that we've gone from $1 billion, and Virginia side, from $1 billion to 350, to where some people are saying that if it does come up for a vote, and the chances of it getting voted on this year are pretty low at this point, before this legislative session is over, which might even just be a death knell at that point. Because if you know anything about legislators of any size, once you don't bring things to a vote or delay votes or saying we got to look at this longer, that's a kill. That's because they know they don't have the votes for it to pass. So, and if it does come back up this year or in the future, the chances of it even being at 350 are probably gone. You're probably at that point talking more, you're starting to get down to the 200 millions, which is kind of insane. If we go to, that's three-quarter reduction in the proposed deal in what, a year and a half by the time if and when they vote on it. So his dance partners are just drying up, and I think what emerges is probably the stay on the site, leverage Maryland's existing investment in the area. Probably looks like his only path at some point here.
Now, in terms of the land oversight, our buddy Rick Snyder thinks there's some sort of reversionary right after 30 years, which would be in 2027. He thinks there's some sort of reversionary right to Prince George's County in the deed. I meant to pull it to check that, and I forgot. So, but I will have that for next time. I will go find the deed and go read it and see what it is. But if we assume that Rick is right and that there is some reversionary type action that happens, that would mean that Prince George's County would have to consent to the building of a new stadium on the Landover site. So that is kind of important if Snyder does not own truly clear title to it. And again, I don't know, I'll have to pull the deed. Yeah, listen, I mean, I think that the drawings that the team released for the new stadium, that was all in burgundy and it looked like a spaceship and fantastic. I was kidding about the supermodel girlfriend thing, but that is sort of where they are with it, I think. Because a stadium like that in today's world, you're talking maybe $2 billion. I mean, it's not a small amount of money, and if he can't convince a local government, either one of them, to do that, they're going to have. I mean, I would think they'd have to go much less because the debt service on $2 billion. I mean, and really the only guarantees you have are 8 games a year, and then maybe two preseason games. Um, that's that is a lot, and I mean, I don't have the budget in front of me, but I mean, the debt service has got to be 100 million a year, maybe. I mean, it's kind of it is not kind of, it is a guesstimate, but I think it would be in somewhere in that range, and that's a lot. And that's also why you saw Jason Wright talking about wanting 100 events a year, which is an insane amount of events per year. But that's why he's saying that. And in terms of Maryland, as you said, yeah, I mean, people need to understand that Chris is 100% right. They're talking about basically allowing him to develop. He's spending money on development they were going to do anyway, and allowing him the courtesy of building there if he wants to, but not really handing him 400 million in construction costs. Here's the question, though, Chris, because I think we agree on that. Is this one because states are wising up to handing billionaires money, or two, is it because Dan Snyder's a sleazeball and nobody likes him, or three, is it a combination of both?
I mean, it's definitely a combination of both. So this stuff is hard. I think, Steve, I love how you opened with the sort of like Jack Kent Cook example, right? Like you couldn't, if you're talking about perfect storms, that was a perfect storm of positivity, right? Of positive momentum. And it still was difficult and probably ended up in a kind of worst of all possible world scenario, right? Because where the current franchise is now, on any number of fronts, but the stadium being one, it can be laid at Jack Kent Cook's doorstep. So I know everyone likes to lionize him, but he did this team no favors on multiple fronts in the last years of his life, and he is. We have Dan Snyder, so I think really people need to be clear-eyed about that, and it's the reason why we had a rushed, poorly built stadium in an area that probably wasn't ready for that stadium. So he's got tons of blame and culpability here and where the franchise is. But you're right. If it was hard then, imagine how hard it is now. And I do think, and we're going to talk a little bit more in another story about this. It's like, money to fund these things is drying up on lots of fronts, and for very good reasons, quite frankly. But you cannot discount the fact that Snyder's toxicity is a major factor, not the only one, but is a major factor in driving these decisions. And here's how these things link. If you're a governmental body, because it depends on all kinds of reasons who's actually making these decisions, but you are a public official having public trust and public funds, and you've got to make the case. Even if you agree, even if you think it's going to be a good idea, you still got to sell that. And if you're trying to go out there and sell this, so think of the Virginia legislature, and this is, the Youngkin administration, this is something that if you're going to do it, now's the time, quite frankly. So it's also like, if you can't do it if you're finding headwinds when you should be having tailwinds, that's a real problem. But think of these legislators who have to go out and sell that we're going to spend, when the first number was $1 billion of public funds, a universally hated person with, pick your scandal, right? And that's even just the quality of the play on the field, right? I mean, you got a whole diner menu of things that the public can be pissed off about here. That's not a good place to go and sell, to a public, spending the public's money to support this guy. So it's just like a perfect storm of, you're not going to get public sentiment, and you're not going to sneak it through, right? It's not going to be with this thing where people aren't paying attention, which is often how a lot of these things get done, right?
Oh, yeah.
No one's paying attention. They know they like football. Let's move on. But you've got daily stories about this guy, football and otherwise. It's hard to sneak something through.
Oh yeah, you can't sneak $1 billion, through a state legislature like this. And but the most important problem of all the scandals and all that stuff is that right now they have about 5 people going to these games, and then 3 of the 5 are the opposing team, and so I mean, seriously, it's why should the state build you a new stadium when you can't even fill the one you have? And by the way, you've reduced the capacity of the one you have by what, 15,000 at least, maybe more. Because they built it in an era when the team was popular and nobody was mad at it. And, now they went, it was at one point almost 90,000, I think. Now they're down to what, maybe 70, 75. I don't know the numbers, but it's something like that. So I think that's part of the problem. But yes, I think to answer my own question, I agree with you. And I think it is a combination of both. And I think it's fairly telling that I think, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but you and I are both kind of on the side of why should the states give money in this situation? And those of you who are new, Chris and I are on drastically opposite sides of the political aisle, and we both agree on this. I think is telling, for sure. So I don't know if this is going to happen for Dan in this point. All hope is not lost, and they can also probably just extend the lease where they are for a couple years. I mean, because the lease is Dan Snyder with himself. They'd have to work this reversionary issue out if that is in fact the case, and I'll find out. But it wouldn't surprise me if they had to do that. I guess the $1 million question is, would the team just move?
Yeah, that's
$1 billion question, more accurately stated.
I actually, I think that's on the table, or I think that's a fear. And maybe not that many people are fearing it, but I think you'd have run into some similar problems. Who wants them, right? I mean, I know people want franchises, so I'm not an idiot, but it's still Snyder. You still bring that problem, right? So it isn't just new franchise and generic owner X, right? It brings a whole handbag of problems. They're the same which are part of the set of problems that he's dealing with and getting this done here. I think I think it's a possibility, but I still think it's a bit of a remote one for a couple of factors. One, I don't think the league would want to see that happen, right? So, and I think what drives a lot of the league's top valuation to least valuation to top fan base to least fan base. This isn't, this is the nation's capital. I mean, this used to be a huge deal. They want a team here. You talk about, federal contractors, Defense Department. I mean, this is, this is a money market. They need this market. So I don't think the league would be. So I think that you'd almost have to be it'd have to be a switcheroo, right? It would have to be let Snyder go to Seattle or wherever, right? And you'd have to. Oh, they already have a team, whatever. So, new team at new city X.
San Antonio,
right? Exactly. And you'd have to bring in an expansion. Like it would be like LA, which probably lasted longer than the NFL would have liked, but they couldn't leave this market teamless for very long.
Well, they were trying to get a team in LA forever, and they just it just couldn't come together. No, I had a great thought. It went totally out of my head. I do think that it is a possibility that the team moves. I don't think it's likely. This team would be, if this was hockey, Washington would be an original six team. It's almost 100 years old. It's 90 years old this year, as a matter of fact. And yeah, I don't think I think the NFL is probably embarrassed about what's going on here in DC or there in DC. But yeah, I don't think they want to have a team that's been around for 90 years to all of a sudden leave. So I don't think they want that to happen. But at the same time, they don't want to run Dan Snyder out for reasons we've talked about many times. A lot of their own closets have a bunch of skeletons in it, just like Dan. Look, here's what Dan needs to do. I said this like 2 years ago. Here's what Dan needs to do. This is what would fix it all. But Dan will never do this because he's an egomaniac. He needs to have a press conference. And in that press conference, he needs to admit everything, open every door, and say, I've been a terrible owner. I've allowed a culture. I personally have allowed a culture of oppression to exist in this building. I've participated in it. I'm completely wrong in doing so. I'm dedicated to improving the franchise. I think if everybody could hear him say that and then pay the women some amount of money, settle these cases with them, just open up every skeleton, open up every closet. I think that would go a long way I mean a long way to fixing the problem. It's kind of like you tell your kids, just tell me what's wrong, just tell me what you did, and it'll be much better for you. And usually if your kid admits it, then you go, okay, well, don't do it again, and let's talk about it. Um, that's what Dan needs to do, and I think that's one thing that Dan won't do is that. And so I don't I don't know how things get better for him at this point. And I guess I've gone back and forth, but I think at the end of the day they're going to be at the Landover site after all this.
Oh, I think that's definitely how this plays out, and I actually think I actually think that that's almost a best case scenario for the
Yeah.
team
Oh,
at this
yeah.
point. Like
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's best case scenario.
and they'd almost do better by just locking that in, having a plan, moving people to the excitement of the new stadium, et cetera, et cetera. Like I think if they actually just accepted that and then said, all right, this is going to be the plan, negotiate that, announce it, and then move forward, they'd be in a better shape. And quite frankly, in Jack Kent Cook's time, that was a little bit further out in the sticks, et cetera, et cetera. But, and with $400 million, I mean, Maryland obviously thinks the area, regardless of Washington franchise, is an important public investment. So, I think the city or the suburban sprawl or however you want to, is moving that way anyway. So I think in future scenarios, some of the negatives of the current site are actually going to get smoothed over. You can reposition the stadium a little bit better to public transit, which is already in the Maryland plan. It would be closer to 2 metro stops. There will be more of a, town or kind of Potemkin village type of thing it's going to spring up around it. So you could actually make a case that they'd be going in a positive growth. It might have taken 25, 30 years for that to sort of materialize, but why abandon it when some of those other fundamentals actually might be catching up to the site?
Yeah, I mean, when Jack and Cook built FedEx Field, the Landover site was terrible in terms of crime. It was very high crime. It was low income. The average median income there inside the Beltway in the Landover area was low. Landover Mall was somewhere you only went if you wanted to get shot. I mean, and apparently Jamal told me Landover Mall is now gone, I guess, there. um,
Yeah.
yeah, and so this is an area in which the state of Maryland recognizes that they need to do more to spur development in the area for the benefit of everybody. If you spend on development, then you have a lot of local businesses, and that attracts people with money, and that you have a lot of local owners who will live in the area and have money and build nice things, and it kind of improves everything. So that's the point. And so yeah, there's this kind of a sense from Maryland that yeah, and I guess you said this already, but we're going to do this. And if you want to be here, Dan, you can. Feel free. We'll have you, but we ain't building it for you. The other thing I guess that could happen here is Dan just decides to forego all things public money and just do something totally on his own. And if he did that, all he would need are some permits, from the local government. If he just bought that land, and where was it? Woodbridge, the one he's got an
Yeah.
option on, a purchase option on. If he just did that, just bought the land and just built a stadium with just say, I'm going to do this without any public funds, he could get that done. But again, then it comes back to, the stadium is too expensive for him to afford the debt service. So it'd have to be another like modern day FedEx field, basically. That's the other option. But I
Yeah. And
think it's also a lot of, sorry, Chris, but I think there's also a lot of ego in that too, because everybody else, but the Giants and the Jets and maybe one other team gets public money, and there may be an ego thing in him not being able to get public money.
Well, yeah, it's another being shunned on all fronts, right? So, like, they go it alone. And let's remember a couple key fundamentals here that are at play, especially towards that idea. Which, obviously, if he can afford it, would probably be his best option at this point. But he probably can't afford it. So, one, his other business, we're not going to go through the greatest hits, but he has no other businesses that have been successful, right? So 10, 15 years ago, he's got a portfolio. Here's this, that, and the other thing, Johnny Rockets, blah, blah, blah. Those have all dried up. So he's in a one business, he's a one business tycoon at this point. Two, so two, let's also remember that he leveraged himself to the hilt just to get this sole ownership of the team. So, the debts are all that. He's already max leveraged through that whole the last couple of years saga. So, he doesn't have a lot of wiggle room. And what I think, if he went with your idea, which maybe it's not like he's got a lot of options. I think what it would mean it would necessitate that he brings on a pretty sizable minority owner. Like he would have to diversify the ownership group that would be the path to financing the stadium. And so, you'd have to see something like that emerge probably to finance it in your path.
So being a real estate finance professional, which is what I do a lot of this in my career as an attorney. You can't just borrow 100% of anything. Okay. Any major commercial construction, you have to have a major equity injection from the principal owner. And so this is what Chris is talking about here. How do you get that? Well, the easiest way to get that is to bring on a minority partner. You take that cash and then, you offer them some percentage, 30% or whatever the number is of the company, which is Pro Football Inc. And then you take that cash and there's your equity injection for the construction project. That's why Chris is saying that. But the other question is, who would want to be his partner?
Well, we come back to this, like it all comes back to when you're this toxic and quite frankly this dumb. Not many people, whether it's owners, the league, these municipalities, like finding friends is hard for Dan Snyder.
Yeah. I mean, it always has been, though. Remember, because Howard Milstein?
Sure.
For those who forget. So to go back to Jack Kent Cooke, when Jack Kent Cooke died, instead of just willing the team to John Kent, wasn't John the son? John, instead of just willing the team to John and handing him enough cash to pay the taxes, the estate taxes on the transfer of title and the transfer of the stock, what Jack Kent Cooke did is created something. I think it was called maybe the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, something along those lines. And he put his entire estate in the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, and that is a worthwhile charity that gives college scholarships out to kids in need and stuff. I mean, it's worthwhile. It still exists today. But that is the reason. And so the instructions in his will were to liquidate the team and take the money from the sale of the team and put it in the foundation. So that's why we were in a situation where there was bidding on the team in the first place. And because he didn't plan his estate properly, which is what you said earlier about him not doing the team a lot of favors in his last years of his life, he didn't give his own son enough cash to make a viable bid. That is where Howard Milstein swooped in. And Howard Milstein was the majority partner in the original bid, and he had Snyder along for the ride as a minority partner. Now, Howard Milstein, it's like, two sleazeballs befriend each other. Howard Milstein was hated by the other NFL owners, and he owned some hockey team. I think he owned the Rangers maybe at one point in time. I know it wasn't the Islanders. I think it was the Rangers. Anyway, and the NFL just told Milstein, we're not going to preview, period. We don't like you. And that's how Snyder swooped in and bought the team in the first, all of that. So Jack Kent Cooke was responsible for that. But I say all of this to say that Snyder's never been good at building a team, forming, cohesive entities. If you go back to the history of Johnny Rockets and Six Flags, and they ran him out of Paramount, with the Tom Cruise thing, and that ended, and nothing goes right. And at some point you have to say, well, it's you, dude. It's you, and this is coming back again. What has he done? Ruined the Washington franchise, and he's now in a position where nobody wants to play ball with him.
Yeah, and so if we move to the other kind of, so it also was announced, and all this is like, we sort of mentioned this earlier, but all these like pretty pictures of stadiums and what it would be those are all sales techniques, basically at that point pointed at the Virginia legislator, right? Like, don't you want to be involved with this? And he released things publicly, and he tried to change the conversation, and trying to change hearts and minds and ultimately votes within that legislature. So we got a lot of stadium news and details, and most of it's just BS sales jobs. But what was interesting was they came out and said, we're looking at a 55,000 seat stadium, which, when you first see it, and I do think there's truth here, you're like, wow, what, like we have all kinds of data points on how far this team, franchise really, has fallen on the field. Production is just but one of many. And quite frankly, whatever, I'll save that rant for later. But 55,000 for a team like this was really eye-popping when you think that's their bragging point. Hey, and a lot of people, I think correctly, were like, well, that actually might be pretty smart, all things considered. But that doesn't mean it isn't kind of a bald fact demonstration about where this fan base is, what's happened to this franchise, when you're bragging about building what would be the smallest stadium in the league.
Yeah, I was surprised at that number. I really was. And I'll just point out that RFK was something like 56.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a stadium that has less capacity than the stadium that they left 30 years ago. It was really shocking. And I'll say this, that the NFL's rule with regard to Super Bowls is that you have to be able to get 65,000 in the stadium. The number is 65. And I have been through this in my real life. And what normally happens is there are a bunch of stadiums that are less than 65, but they'll throw in bleacher seats and stuff to get it up to 65. But I don't know if you can get another 10,000 in a stadium. That's a lot. Normally I've seen it's been a few thousand. I don't think I've ever seen 10,000 seats added. Not to say they can't. I mean, I'm no expert in stadium design, but that's a lot. But yeah, I mean, it really says something about the state of the franchise. You're simultaneously asking these local, municipal, and state governments to pay hundreds of millions of dollars, yet saying, yeah, we can only attract 50 something odd thousand people, at the same time, where it's like, most other stadiums are 60, 65. The Raiders stadium is 60 or 65 or something. The new one in Las Vegas. I do think there's a trend in the NFL of going smaller generally, but it would not, as you said, none of them are anywhere near 55. I was shocked at that number. I really was.
Yeah, and now, as you mentioned, Las Vegas's new stadium is only 65. The Buffalo one, I think, is in the 65 range. And they're getting a boatload of municipal money there, folks, by the way. So that might be the trend, and you can understand why. And so when I kind of looked across, it took the sting out of it a little bit, and I think, and so why the trend in smaller stadiums, I think, is because the NFL is a TV show first and foremost. From its financing, from its business model, to how it presents, to the reality that fan bases are, often very regional and, in fact, sometimes national. That's actually a case in Washington. You could make an argument that they have a stronger national fan base than local fan base, but that doesn't help with ticket receipts. So these stadiums are contracting. They look better if they're filled, right? So if you're just talking about staging a TV show, no one wants to see these like college football style stadiums that are half full, which is not just a Washington problem, by the way. So that is the trend. But again, here we are with Washington coming up and being at the tail end of a downward trend, right? So, they're still like the last. Even if the trend is smaller, they're still the smallest. And it also means that they're building something that, if you just think about Snyder's ambitions, even 4 to 5 years ago, hell, even 3 years ago, Super Bowls, Final Fours. He looks at what goes on in LA with their stadium. He looks at Jerry World. He looks at even the Las Vegas one, which, yes, might have a more sustainable number of seats, but is still like a big cathedral, for the team and is going to have events up the wazoo. He's building himself out of all of those things, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it is. And it's I was sitting on my phone, so I'm trying to look up what the Jerry World capacity is here. Okay, capacity for Jerry World says, this is according to Wikipedia, so take this for what you will, but 80,000 expandable to 105,000. That's what Wikipedia says is the capacity of it. So much larger. I mean, but listen, Dallas's fan base is way, way bigger than Washington's fan base, for sure. It's funny because I don't think it could be a worse time for the team to have to start thinking about a new stadium. I think it's certainly in my lifetime, but maybe in the history of the franchise, this is a low point for this franchise. They're at the bottom. The owner's hated. The team is terrible. Nobody goes to the games. In terms of the stadium and stuff and the visual presentation, it's kind of like having like America's Got Talent during, when they weren't letting anybody in the building. The energy, the crowd isn't there. It dramatically affects the presentation of the show. And so the NFL doesn't want empty stadiums with no energy or anything. That's not good for the visual presentation of the program. So yeah, they do want people in the stand. There's a reason why they don't pan up to crowds for Washington games very often. They don't want to show a bunch of empty seats. But it's just kind of funny that the stadium thing is coming up now when there couldn't be a worse time to want to convince anybody to go to a game or build a stadium.
And let me just say, to the dedicated few, we'll call them, the real diehard fans out there that get their jock strapped all knotted up all the time. Everyone was all like, full of vim and vigor, yelling at the Virginia legislators that trashed, what was that guy, whatever, that one dude that you mentioned, who basically had a very, damning quote about it. And they were like, you guys got to get over yourself. Look at the fundamentals. You can love the team, all of that, blah, blah, blah. But this idea that you're like, how could you insult us? You don't know what you're talking about. You fans are nuts. You're nuts. Like, you can love the team. Sure. I still love lots of parts of it, but put your reality goggles on here, and the sort of like small amount of like, rakes and pitchforks that come out at these people when they say these kind of statements, like, accept the truth, man. Like, admit that there's a problem and move on. And all of you just win and everything's solved. You're morons. You're morons. This is not a just win and it'll solve everything. I understand that winning breeds stuff. Will it help? Of course. But we are past the point of a 10-6, 11-5, one season run solving these problems. Those don't go at the fundamentals. This is actually what's happening on the field or the football operations really is the days that's going to solve things. You're delusional.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that finally someone else in one of these shows called people morons, except for me. So that makes me happy. And Chris, I think the people you're talking about are just the sycophants.
Yeah.
Out there. That's what they are. And I've mentioned them by name on the Hogseye a couple times.
All 250 of you, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's not more than you, and it's all the Twitter crowd. By the way, I mean, quit Twitter. It's such an awful thing. It really is. But just the Steve Thomas bit of advice for the day. Yeah, I mean, it's all the things you said, of course, are correct. We've had people come at us. I've had people come at me over, me being negative and all that. But listen, reality can punch you in the face sometimes. It can. And I just don't know how some of you out there can be blinded considering all the things the team has done wrong. This stuff with the, mistreating women and all that. Don't you have mothers, girlfriends, sisters, wives, friends, female friends, and you're okay with it? And you can just separate, the team on the field from all this? I can't do that personally. So I don't get it. Wake up, people.
So we're gonna move on to more billionaires doing interesting things or being nose bent in a joint about not getting public money. But I do love this. The great Raylan Givens, the Elmore Leonard character of books and then TV's Justified fame, is the greatest quote about that I think sums up Dan Snyder. If you run into an a-hole in the morning, you ran into an a-hole. If you run into an a-hole all day, you're the a-hole. And that's pretty much the defining maxim of the Snyder era. And the truth is, to pull off big things, you need partners, you need collaborators, you need public trust, and you need to be able to make these kind of deals on all fronts. And he's just on an island.
Yeah, I agree. You said enough.
So we look at David Tepper now. Interesting. This has got a lot of the same elements. David Tepper and the Carolina Panthers. He's a relatively new owner. Remember, he's the one that bought it from Jerry Rich. Yada yada. Right. We've sort of the Panthers for so many reasons. The Panthers always kind of lurk on the outside of any story about Washington at this point. But he's now in a fight, or maybe in the aftermath of the fight is maybe the way to put it, where a company that he owns that was helping to finance and build a new team facility in Rock Hill, which is about 30 miles outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, so a suburb, and apparently a big place for high school football. So there was like a, football in the culture, in a boardroom, it made sense. But the deal has crumbled, and David Tepper has taken one of his companies into bankruptcy to deal with the fallout. And you're going to be more informative than me, Steve, on this. But it seems like to me, once Tepper didn't get the public financing he thought, even though the project, I think the article we read in The Athletic said you can see the thing from the highway, right? It's built enough to see it, like it's a physical presence as you drive by it. So they've gotten that far down. This is not a conceptual thing. What do they call it? Shovels have hit the ground, in the real estate business or whatever. So it was 3/4 built or significantly built. The deal has crumbled for public financing. And rather than put his own money in or finish off his commitment, he has walked away from it and is using bankruptcy court as a way to sort through the debts for his company to basically get out of the deal and building the rest of it.
So bankruptcies, particularly business bankruptcies, are not all the same. The one he's filed is a Chapter 11, which is not a bankruptcy that's going to get him out of paying a bunch of debts. What it does is it's known as the reorganization bankruptcy. That's what he's filed. Chapter 13 is the liquidation, and that's the one. If you file a Chapter 13, that's the one where the court will order your assets liquidated, and then whatever they can get for the money goes to the creditors, and the rest of them are just out of luck. That is Chapter 13. He's filed a Chapter 11. So he's not trying to get out of debts necessarily. He's trying to string it along, get a longer time period, avoid some, creditors trying to collect on security, like secured property or personal property. That's what he's doing. And it's not, I think bankruptcies, especially in business, get a bit of a bad rap because most of the time these folks are not truly saying we have no money. All they're really saying is we need help organizing our debts. And in the case of Tepper, first of all, I've never heard of Rock Hill. And I don't know how he could expect some suburb to issue 225 whatever million in bonds. That's a lot for a suburb, one little town. But I gotta give him not maybe a pass, but I gotta give him a bit of a break since he didn't file a Chapter 13 and just say, here, buy this half done building and then leave me alone. I mean, he didn't do that. So this is really just kind of a business move more than anything else. It doesn't offend me.
Yeah. Beyond my offense at his general billionaire status, I understand that it's a mechanic or it's a yes. tool and that it is used and utilized in these kinds of situations.
Yes, all the time. Yeah.
Now, if you look, so I don't begrudge using the instruments at your disposal through private-public agreements to move forward, but it is kind of, I mean, if you look at the bigger context, it is a little bit more, it does get a little bit grosser in terms of like, well, why did you think this was a good idea? Why did you expect those public funds? You obviously, you didn't have that in place before you broke ground, et cetera, et cetera. So he is pulling out of this. He lost that game of chicken, and then even late in the game decided to pull up his investments and return home and use the bankruptcy court as a way to basically manage the exit.
Well, Dave Tepper is pretty ruthless in business. Don't forget, he's the one that owned, I forget which little tiny football league it is. It's the one that Alex Zeiss was the only fan of. It wasn't the AFL. It was one of those. It was the one that quit about 4 games into the season. I don't know, 2 years ago. And Tepper was the principal owner, and he just yanked his financing. And I think he was the principal owner. And he just yanked his financing. Remember this?
Yeah.
Without even a shred of remorse at all. So does it surprise me that he would just, it doesn't surprise me that any owner is so egotistical. They think that they can convince anybody to give him anything. And so because he knows he can convince the state to give him money, let's just start building this building now anyway. That doesn't surprise me. And it also doesn't surprise me he would just go, boom, bankruptcy, the end. Um, that doesn't surprise me at all. It doesn't really offend me, because I just know what he's done is not an offensive thing. Again, it would be different story if it's chapter 13. But chapter 11, I kind of shrug my shoulders at it a little bit.
Well, let's update us all, and myself and Steve included, about Rock Hill. So Rock Hill is actually in South Carolina, Steve. So it isn't in North Carolina. Rock Hill is the largest city in York County, South Carolina. Everything's relative. And it is the fifth largest city in the state. So in a state like South Carolina, it's still only number 5. It is also the 4th largest city of the Charlotte metropolitan area, behind Charlotte, Concord, and Gastonia. And as of the 220 census, the population was 74,000. So it's probably a little bit bigger than we assumed, but Charlotte sits kind of, it's one of these border metropolitan areas. So, some of it spills off into South Carolina and some of it spills off into North Carolina. But even in that context, what did I say? It was the 4th largest city in that Charlotte. No, that 5th largest city in South Carolina, but only the 4th largest in the Charlotte sprawl.
Yeah.
So it's not huge, right? 74,000 people is pretty mid-size at best. So we are talking about kind of a celebrated suburb, and they were being asked to pony up $225 million in public bonds.
That's a ton of money. I can tell you that. That is a lot of money. I don't think that's a reasonable request. It seems like this is sort of Dave Tepper moving the Redskins out to Woodbridge. It kind of has that.
But this isn't even the stadium. This is the team facility.
You're right. That's true. Yeah. And which is different. Yeah. Because he's not talking about moving the stadium, is it? It was just the team facility. But it's still an awful long way, and it seems like it's on kind of the other side of the world from where the stadium is and all of that. I just think the guy, I don't think he really cares where it goes, particularly. He just wants somebody else to pay for it. That's all it is. I don't think Rock Hill has anything to do with anything except he thought he could get free money. And personally, I mean, I've said it before. I mean, being a fiscal conservative, it does offend me when these governments hand out free money to people who can get financing themselves. I don't know why taxpayers should have to pay for these things. I really don't. I don't think any government ought to give a dime to any of these owners, Dave Tepper and Dan Snyder included. So big part of me is glad that this happened to him.
And if you just to do a quick compare and contrast, so he was looking for 200. No, he didn't get it, but 225 million of public financing for his team facility. That's probably the number that they'll be talking about in the Virginia legislature for the stadium. So it does. Yeah, so it does. It is kind of an interesting compare and contrast.
Sounds like they're talking about zero in the Virginia legislature right now.
Yeah, right. So it is kind of fascinating, but it is an interesting look into, what these, and what is he? He's the wealthiest owner in the NFL?
Neither one of us knew that, but we read that in our show prep notes and stuff. Yeah, Dave Tepper apparently is the wealthiest owner in the NFL, which has surprised me.
So he can buy the
Microsoft guy who owns the Seahawks would be the most, but guess not.
Paul Allen.
Yeah, or the Rams, Kroenke would be the other one.
Yeah, so that it definitely is somewhat surprising. But, we'll Steve, the next thing is we looked at an article in The Athletic, which, of course, I don't have right up in front of me, but I can get to it pretty quick, I think. That's the rumor. It was called Inflation Plunge in Stock Market, Global Uncertainty in Soccer League. leagues and stuff. This isn't purely America. But its point was, with some American examples, that, right now, at least, the valuations of these teams are fairly recession, global uncertainty proof. And, not in a U.S. context, he looks at two interesting developments in terms of teams selling or potentially selling, which starts to set the market. One, which we've been talking about and looking at, and I'm sure when a deal happens, we will look at in depth, but is what's going to happen in Denver. And I think Steve and I are both on record saying that is definitely coming in between 4 and 5 billion. And then now some rumors that it could top 5. And apparently Phil Knight to the Portland Trailblazers and saying, "Hey, I didn't see a for sale sign on the lawn, but would you be interested in selling? And here's my price." And that price is $2 billion, which is kind of crazy for a mid to small market NBA team, considering that when the Panthers just sold to David Tepper, it was only 2.75, and we're talking an NFL franchise versus NBA. And so, if that doesn't tell you where these things are moving, you don't need more. That is a great anecdotal piece of evidence.
Don't you wonder if the team finances justify these prices? I do. And or is a big part of this value just, is it a markup because you're buying a professional sports team? That's what I really wonder. It's if Forbes looked at these things, looked at the finances honestly, would they come up with a valuation like that, or is it a premium because it's the NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball? That's really what I kind of wonder, because I have a hard time believing that the Denver Broncos are a $5 billion company. I agree and still agree. That seems to be the number that's going to happen, but I really have a hard time believing that. One NBA or NFL team, it's just a ton. I don't know. As far as the Portland Trailblazers, I don't know how you wouldn't take it. I don't know who even owns the team currently, but whoever it is, I would take $2 billion and be happy. A lot of times it's an ego thing to own sports teams, and so maybe hang on to it for ego reasons. I mean, it's the only reason Dan Snyder isn't selling. If it was purely a business thing, Dan Snyder was sold a long time ago. And although he hadn't any buyers, but so I really think at some point the roller coaster's got to. The roller coaster maybe not the right word. I think at some point the increase has got to taper off a little bit for these sports team values. I hear you typing, Chris. Are you trying to figure out who the owner of the Portland Trailblazers is?
Snyder exit scenarios is the fact, let's say Denver sells at 5 billion, which would push a fresh start Washington franchise would start at that price, I think. So my hope is that he just can't walk away from that amount, but that's probably also just still pixie dust. It's actually the Paul Allen family. Paul Allen died a few years ago, so that owns the Trailblazers now. So you're talking about Paul Allen and his, family, Phil Knight. One of the things that the point that this article makes, which I thought was a super interesting one, and it's Daniel Kaplan, by the way, in The Athletic, that wrote the article, is he said it's really kind of a classic supply and demand issue. One, there's only a limited supply of professional sports franchises, and I mean, globally, these leagues don't expand very fast. The NBA just announced that it doesn't have plans to expand. We had a story we might have talked about WNBA. That's not changing any of this calculus. These leagues don't expand much in all, whether you're talking cricket or soccer or whatever, right? Like whatever kind of regional context, you don't see. So the supply is limited and it grows very slowly. But the kind of interesting counterpoint that I think feeds into what you're saying, Steve, that this article makes is, but we're growing billionaires monthly. So the supply of billionaires who want this cachet, that want this ego stroke, that want to be playing in this world, that supply is increasing, probably in an unhealthy level. But then the supply is basically status quo on what they can buy. So I think that's also at play. You have more people wanting to buy and more people who have the war chests to buy, and there are very few things to buy.
Yeah, so supply and demand. Just my point with it is just like watch Shark Tank. So somebody will come on Shark Tank and say, "I want $500,000 or a 10% investment in my company," and what that means is he's valuing the company at 5 million. Um, and so if you do that for NFL teams, does it really come out to 5 billion? I just would venture a guess not. But I think you make a good point, and Kaplan makes a good point. I think he said there in the article there's 151 professional sports franchises in the United States. I don't know how he gets to that number. I guess he's adding in the WNBA and soccer, I guess, in there. But yeah, I think you're right in saying there's a bunch of new billionaires. And so what does that do if you have a lot big demand it in a limited supply, it drives up prices. If you tried to buy a car recently, you know this because that is what's going on in the car business. In terms of that WNBA thing, first of all, I think they're nuts to expand a league that should be bankrupt as it is. And that's not to say women can't play basketball, all that, but simple fact is it makes no money. There's a reason the players make low six figures salaries. It's because nobody watches it, nobody cares. Why are they expanding? Probably for political reasons driven by the NBA. But yeah, I wouldn't pay $5 billion for one of these teams, but certainly these billionaires are looking for things to do.
And because we've been following the Denver Broncos sale, it's kind of one of those drips, and then the dam will burst when a sale happens. There'll be lots to talk about. But there was a couple of little tidbits in here. We've said, the media is saying, everyone understands that Rob Walton, the Walton family, is the front runner here. That's sort of been the case for a while, last like couple months. But they did say in here that one of the things that he's done lately to sort of sweeten the pot is actually claimed that he'll build a new stadium for the team, and that has already pushed out one competitive ownership group with said, okay, if that's the new normal in terms of what we're talking about in negotiations, we're out. So it is, and I found that interesting. One that just kind of being kind of not ruthless, that's the wrong word, but being knowing where to push the Walton's edge here and what was going to be the cherry on top. And then the fact that building your own stadium is just the cherry on top to what might be a close to $5 billion offer.
It's so these sports valuations have gotten so out of control. It really has. Again, I mean, I guess I'll conclude by saying I wonder when is the growth going to taper off? It has to. It seems to me it has to. How much more? And this is more of a Forbes question. I don't think Chris and I haven't answered this, but how much more can this growth really go? I mean, 10 years from now, are we going to see $10 billion NFL teams? Or is it going to be maybe 7? That's what I wonder most about all this. And I don't know the answer to that at all, but that's what I wonder.
Well, I mean, you could sort of, if you just take the NFL, right, which is, well, even globally, I know it's not a global sport, but Chelsea Football Club sold for $3 billion recently, right? So it just sort of shows you an internet, it kind of gives you a comp there. So let's say if we look at the last two NFL sales, we have the Panthers, which we talked about, which came in at $2.75 billion at the time that David Tepper purchased that. Was it 6 or 7 years ago, somewhere around there?
Yeah, something like that.
And we've got this impending Denver Broncos sale, which let's say it comes in right at $5 million. You're talking about, I mean, it's not a full double, but it's trended doubling in value in a relatively short amount of time. So like your 10 billion, if you start to just so if another franchise, hopefully Washington, comes for sale in the next 5 to 7 years, well, what do we see? I can't do math on the fly, but 2.75 to 5 is what, in the 40% increase. So you're getting close to doubling. So your idea of 10 billion, if you just look at now, does the bubble burst? Maybe, but if
That's
you just
what I'm
look at
asking.
that,
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
but
I
who
mean
knows?
the trend line. Yeah, I mean, the trend line is headed to 10 billion. That's why I picked that number out of thin air. Was that reason? But my question isn't the math. My question is, will the trend taper off because the values are getting so insane that the income and the business does not justify the value?
Well, one of the things that Kaplan talks about is the reason, one of the reasons it's driven this is, obviously one of our main talking points and trends is the explosion in the media landscape, and that there's so much new money in these TV contracts, and there's new players, and you've got, mega corporations like Apple and Amazon and whatnot getting involved here. And he said that is obviously a boon financially for these leagues and is driving their values. But he does make the point that that's finite as well. Like that's not, to kind of feeding to your point. That might be like driving some of this new money and giving them new capabilities, but that's not, there's going to be a cap on that. Once the media landscape sort of figures itself out, it'll sort of settle back in. You don't know if some of these companies that are like leveraged and do a bunch of stuff start to say like, why are we paying these, live sports fees? I don't see that happening in a while, but it's certainly possible. So like, he said, even that financial driver, isn't necessarily evergreen, right? Like, and probably fairly fickle.
Yeah. Well, yes. Yes. And all of this is, again, neither Chris or I are financial experts. And all this is, I think, fascinating. And we'll only have to see if we're still doing the show in 3 years or 4 years and the next team gets sold. We'll have to see what the trend is.
I am really interested to see what the details are when this Denver stuff shakes out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, we've talked about before, we're not talking, if you look at all the factors, I think you're talking about a top 15, maybe even top 10 franchise. I'm talking about, and if they go on to win a Super Bowl with Russell Wilson in the next like 2 to 3 years, which is, certainly possible, then, who knows? But, but this isn't like, it's a solid to popular to good fundamentals franchise, but it's not top 5. I think it has to argue itself into the top 10.
Well, and the Panthers were not top 15 at the time of the sale.
No.
Sells. They were kind of at bottom 20 maybe, I'd say, something along those lines. And yeah, I agree with let's put the Broncos in the middle sort of somewhere. Yeah, I agree. So if like some team like I think Jerry Jones threw out $9 billion a while ago for the Cowboys, I believe. That number pops into my head. So I do think if you like the Patriots or the Cowboys or the Giants sold, the numbers would be dramatically more than the Broncos, which again makes me wonder what is the end of the rainbow for this.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, all bubbles burst eventually, so it'll be super interesting, and hopefully there aren't too many local municipalities that get dragged down in the process of that bursted bubble, which it seems like these state and local governments are getting smarter about.
Well, yeah, I mean, what are they really getting out of this? Out of spending all that money, and at some point, if the number's big enough, you can't just keep taxing hotels and car rentals. The money has got to come from somewhere else too. So, I don't know. We'll see.
Wanted to close with just a quick little check-in because NILs is just the gift that keeps on giving. Where and we talked about Saban and all that in our last show, and I think both of our conclusions was a little bit that he was sort of picking a fight. Or he was talking to his boosters as much as he was complaining about the economics of the sport. He just used a sort of like cranky cudgel way to do that. But Ohio State has come out even more overtly and just said, hey, look, fan base, boosters, financial apparatus around this, franchise, this university.
It's a franchise.
If you want us to, yeah, it is. If you want us to play, we're gonna have to pony up. What did he say? 13 million or 30 million, something with a 3.
13 million is what he said.
Yeah, that's what we're gonna need to stay competitive.
Props for honesty, man. I mean, the Saban thing had a bit of a bad grandpa vibe to it. But yeah, props for honesty for the Ohio State guy. I'd much rather see that and him just bluntly say, yeah, we need 13 million from you boosters in order to keep our team together. I admire the honesty. What can you say?
Yeah. Right. It's like, this is these are the rules of play. We can like them, we can not like them, but like if we want to play ball, this is the new reality.
Yeah, amen, brother.
All right, so we're all rooting for Ohio State next year. No, we're not. So Steve, you're in quiet mode now, although that I don't know if quiet mode really makes sense for this franchise. But what's going on in the Hogside universe?
Yeah, no, it's the NFL is going into quiet mode usually from the early to mid June to right before training camp is the dead zone. So when everybody's on vacation, the coaches aren't in the building, all that. We, the Hogstar, are doing our position group breakdown series. We're in the middle of that. And so, and we're of course talking about all these stadium issues and whatnot on that show too. Rick Snyder's show is in a bit of a hiatus now, season's discontent, but he still does his YouTube thing with his little 2-minute ditties. So Rick Snyder's Washington. So pay attention to that as well.
All right. And we will see you in 2 weeks.